You really think you can decide who deserves help around here? The shout cut across the parking lot just seconds before every head turned toward the front office window of Reed Fuel Station. Marcus Reed looked up from the gas pump receipt in his hand as the sound of cracking glass echoed through the humid North Carolina afternoon. For a moment, nobody moved. The line of cars waiting beside the pumps seemed frozen in place. Even the low rumble of engines felt distant beneath the tension spreading through the air. Marcus stood still, his weathered work boots planted firmly on the concrete. Sunlight reflected off the shattered storefront glass scattered across the sidewalk. Across from him stood Linda Parker, a woman who had spent the better part of 3 years reminding everyone in the neighborhood that she believed Marcus did not belong there. Her white SUV sat crooked near the entrance, one door still open. Her face was flushed with anger. Several people had already raised their phones. Someone was recording. Someone else whispered that the police had been called. Linda pointed toward the growing line of vehicles waiting at the pumps. "This has gone too far," she shouted. "You're giving away fuel while the rest of us have to follow the rules." Murmurs spread through the crowd. A young father standing beside an aging pickup truck lowered his eyes. An elderly woman waiting near pump 4 folded her arms tightly across her chest. Marcus recognized almost everyone there. For the past week, after severe storms had left hundreds of families struggling across the county, he had quietly used his own money to provide emergency fuel assistance. No cameras, no reporters, no speeches, just enough gas to help people get to work, pick up medicine, or drive their children somewhere safe. He never expected gratitude. He certainly never expected this. The summer heat pressed down heavily across the station. The scent of gasoline mixed with fresh rain lingering from the previous night's storm. Above the pumps, a faded American flag fluttered gently in the breeze. Marcus glanced toward the damaged window, then back toward the people waiting in line. Some looked nervous. Others looked embarrassed. A few seemed afraid that the free fuel program was about to disappear. Linda reached for her phone. "Don't worry," she announced loudly. "The police are already on their way." The confidence in her voice made several people exchange uneasy looks. Marcus said nothing. His broad shoulders remained relaxed. His expression never changed. Years of running a small business had taught him that not every fight needed an immediate answer. Across the lot, a teenage employee named Tyler stepped closer. "Mr. Reed," he said quietly, "should we stop serving people until this gets sorted out?" Marcus looked toward the line of cars stretching almost to the road. He saw exhausted faces, working families, retirees, parents holding sleeping children in back seats, people who had already been through enough. He folded the receipt and slipped it into his pocket. Then he gave a small shake of his head. "No," he said calmly. "Keep helping people." Tyler blinked. Even now, Marcus nodded. Especially now. The crowd fell silent. In the distance, faint sirens began to grow louder. Linda smiled for the first time all afternoon. She believed victory was only minutes away. What she didn't know was that before the sun set that evening, the entire town would learn a truth she had spent years refusing to see. The sirens continued drawing closer, but Marcus Reed barely seemed to notice them. Instead, he focused on the customer standing at Pump 6, an elderly man whose pickup truck looked nearly as old as the station itself. Marcus finished entering the fuel amount, handed him the receipt, and offered the same calm smile he gave everyone. It was the kind of smile that came from years of carrying burdens without asking anyone else to carry them for him. Most people driving through Oak Hollow knew Marcus as the owner of Reed Fuel Station, but very few knew how much of his life had been poured into the property beneath his boots. 20 years earlier, the station had been a struggling roadside business with faded signs, leaking equipment, and more debt than profit. Marcus had purchased it with savings accumulated from years of working double shifts at warehouses, trucking companies, and construction sites across North Carolina. He had repaired the pumps himself, painted the walls himself, installed the lighting himself. Some nights, he worked until 2 in the morning before sleeping in a small office chair behind the counter. Back then, people told him the station would never survive. They said larger chains would eventually force him out. Yet somehow, year after year, Reed Fuel Station remained standing. The building was not impressive. The paint showed signs of age. The parking lot carried cracks from countless summers. But people trusted the man who ran it. During winter storms, Marcus stayed open when other businesses closed. During power outages, he brought generators to elderly residents. When local families struggled with medical bills, anonymous donations often appeared in church collection boxes. Few ever discovered where the money came from. Marcus preferred it that way. 5 years earlier, everything changed when his wife, Angela, passed away after a long illness. The grief nearly broke him. For months, he moved through life like a man walking through fog. Yet even then, he continued opening the station every morning before sunrise. Some customers noticed the sadness in his eyes. Others noticed the empty wedding ring chain he wore beneath his shirt. Nobody asked many questions. Small towns often understand silence better than words. Over time, helping others became the thing that helped Marcus survive his own pain. Whenever someone needed assistance, he found a way to show up. Not because he wanted recognition. Not because he expected gratitude. Because he remembered what it felt like when strangers had helped him during his darkest days. That was why the recent storms weighed heavily on him. Thousands across the county had lost power. Roads had flooded. Businesses had closed. Families were choosing between fuel and groceries. Marcus saw the exhaustion on their faces every day. He heard it in their voices. 3 days earlier, he made a decision. He would use a portion of the station's emergency reserve fund to provide free fuel assistance for those most affected. The program was simple. No paperwork. No speeches. Just enough gas to help people reach work, school, hospitals, and shelters. Word spread quickly. By the second day, cars lined the road before sunrise. By the third day, people were driving from neighboring towns. Most arrived grateful. A few arrived skeptical. And one person seemed unable to tolerate it at all. Across the parking lot, Linda Parker stood near the damaged storefront, still convinced she understood Marcus Reed better than anyone else. The truth was she barely knew him at all. Long before the police sirens became part of that afternoon, Linda Parker had already decided what kind of man Marcus Reed was. The decision had been made years ago, and nothing Marcus did seemed capable of changing her mind. From the moment he purchased the old fuel station on the edge of Oak Hollow, Linda treated him like an outsider whose success was somehow temporary. She chaired neighborhood meetings, organized community events, and maintained close relationships with several influential property owners throughout the county. People listened when Linda spoke. Some agreed with her. Others simply found it easier not to argue. Her home sat on a hill overlooking the eastern side of town, a large brick house with carefully trimmed hedges and an American flag hanging beside the front porch. She often spoke about preserving traditions and protecting the character of the community. Yet whenever conversations turned toward Marcus, her tone always seemed to change. At first, the disagreements were small. Complaints about traffic entering the station. Complaints about delivery trucks arriving too early. Complaints about outdoor lighting that she claimed was too bright. Marcus responded politely every time. He attended meetings, followed regulations, made adjustments when reasonable. Nothing seemed to satisfy her. Over the years, many residents noticed the pattern. Whenever Reed Fuel Station received praise, Linda found criticism. Whenever Marcus helped organize a charity drive, she questioned his motives. Whenever local newspapers mentioned his community work, she dismissed it as publicity. The strange part was that Marcus rarely responded. He simply kept working. That silence frustrated Linda more than any argument ever could. 3 days earlier, when news of the fuel assistance program spread through town, Linda viewed it differently than everyone else. While struggling families saw relief, she saw influence. While parents saw kindness, she saw attention. While neighbors saw generosity, she convinced herself there had to be another reason behind it. The longer the lines became, the more determined she grew. By the second day, she had begun making calls. She contacted town officials. She contacted county offices. She contacted anyone willing to listen. Each conversation ended the same way. Marcus was operating legally. The fuel assistance program violated no regulations. Yet Linda refused to accept those answers. Standing near the damaged storefront now, she watched customers continue receiving fuel despite the growing tension. That only deepened her frustration. In her mind, the arrival of law enforcement would finally force someone to stop Marcus. Around the station, nervous whispers moved through the crowd. A mother standing beside a minivan quietly reassured her children. A delivery driver checked the time on his watch. Tyler continued helping customers, though his hands moved more slowly than before. Above them all, dark clouds drifted across the late afternoon sky, softening the sunlight that reflected from the station windows. Then the sirens stopped. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise itself. 2 patrol vehicles rolled into the parking lot. Doors opened. Deputies stepped out. Every conversation immediately faded away. Linda straightened her shoulders. Confidence returned to her face. She believed the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. Marcus simply looked toward the approaching officers and folded his hands in front of him. His expression remained calm, but several people in the crowd noticed something unusual. Unlike everyone else watching the police arrive, Marcus did not look worried at all. Deputy vehicles settled into place beside the pumps as flashing lights reflected across windshields and polished chrome. The crowd instinctively stepped back, creating a wide corridor through the center of the station. Sheriff Daniel Brooks emerged from the lead vehicle, his gray uniform crisp despite the long day that was clearly already behind him. The lines around his eyes suggested experience rather than age. He surveyed the scene slowly, taking in the damaged storefront, the waiting customers, the deputies spreading through the parking lot, and finally the 2 people standing at the center of the tension. Linda Parker wasted no time. She moved toward the sheriff with quick, confident steps. "Sheriff Brooks, thank goodness you are here," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This situation has gotten completely out of control." Daniel listened without interruption. Linda pointed toward the fuel pumps where customers continued receiving assistance. "He is creating chaos," she continued. "Traffic is backing up. People are coming from outside town. Someone needs to stop this immediately." The sheriff nodded once, but asked no questions. His attention drifted toward Marcus. The station owner stood quietly near pump 3, one hand resting against the fuel terminal. He looked less like a man facing trouble and more like someone waiting patiently for a scheduled appointment. That calmness seemed to irritate Linda even more. "Are you hearing me?" she asked. "Look around. This is exactly what I warned everyone about." Nearby, several customers exchanged uncertain glances. A mother holding her daughter's hand looked from Linda to Marcus and back again. Tyler remained beside the register kiosk, unsure whether to continue serving customers. The air felt heavy. Even the distant sounds of passing traffic seemed muted beneath the tension hanging over the station. Sheriff Brooks finally spoke. "I would like to understand exactly what happened today." Linda immediately began explaining. She described the fuel program. She described her concerns. She described the crowds. She described what she believed Marcus was doing wrong. The explanation continued for several minutes. Throughout it all, Marcus never interrupted. He simply listened. When Linda finally finished, Daniel turned toward him. "Mr. Reed." The entire crowd seemed to lean forward. Marcus glanced briefly at the waiting vehicles. A young nurse sat inside one car, still wearing hospital scrubs. An older couple waited in another. Several utility workers stood beside their trucks after spending days restoring power throughout the county. Marcus answered quietly. People needed help. The simplicity of the response caused a ripple of whispers through the crowd. Linda threw her hands into the air. "That is not the point." Marcus met her gaze without hostility. "Actually, Linda, that is exactly the point." For a moment, nobody spoke. A warm breeze moved across the lot, stirring loose papers near the damaged storefront. Somewhere above them, thunder rumbled faintly behind distant clouds. Sheriff Brooks looked toward one of his deputies. The deputy gave a subtle nod and handed him a tablet. Daniel studied the screen carefully. Whatever he saw caused his expression to sharpen slightly. Then he looked back at Marcus. "You continued the assistance program today, even after receiving complaints?" "Yes, sir," Marcus answered. "I did." Linda smiled. It was the smile of someone who believed a confession had just been made. What she failed to notice was that Sheriff Brooks did not seem concerned by Marcus's answer at all. In fact, for the first time since arriving, the sheriff appeared far more interested in something else entirely. The parking lot remained silent as Sheriff Brooks continued reviewing the information on the tablet. The flashing patrol lights reflected across the station windows and the rows of waiting vehicles. Linda stood with her arms crossed, visibly confident that every passing second brought her closer to being proven right. Around her, the crowd watched carefully. Nobody seemed willing to leave. Everyone sensed that something important was unfolding. Daniel scrolled through several screens before finally lowering the tablet. His gaze moved toward one of the deputies standing near the entrance. Did you collect statements from witnesses? He asked. Yes, Sheriff, the deputy replied. Several. Linda immediately stepped forward. You do not need witness statements. The situation is obvious. Daniel looked at her calmly. I prefer facts. The response seemed to catch her off guard. Across the lot, Tyler quietly resumed helping customers. The steady clicking of fuel pumps filled the air. One vehicle pulled away. Another rolled forward. Despite everything happening around them, people still needed fuel. They still needed to get home. Marcus remained focused on that reality. The sheriff turned toward another deputy. What about surveillance footage? We have footage from multiple angles, the deputy answered, including recordings provided by residents. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Several people glanced down at their phones. Many had recorded portions of the afternoon. Linda's confident expression flickered briefly before returning. That footage will show exactly what I have been saying, she declared. Daniel nodded slowly. Perhaps. He opened another file on the tablet. The late afternoon sun slipped behind a bank of clouds, casting the station in softer light. A cool breeze moved through the parking lot. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime rang faintly from a neighboring building. For a moment, the atmosphere felt strangely still. Then the sheriff asked a question nobody expected. Mr. Reed, how long have you been coordinating the county emergency fuel response? Several heads turned immediately. Linda blinked. The what? She asked. Marcus answered simply. Since Monday morning. The crowd exchanged confused looks. Daniel continued. And the county approved extension requests through today? Yes, sir. Linda laughed nervously. What extension requests? The sheriff did not answer her immediately. Instead, he enlarged a document on the screen and showed it to one of the deputies. The deputy examined it carefully before nodding. Everything appears current. The crowd grew quieter. Even the people at the pump stopped talking. Linda's confidence began slipping away, though she fought to hide it. There must be some mistake, she said. Nobody told the community about any of this. Marcus finally spoke. The goal was helping people, not making announcements. The words landed heavily across the parking lot. Several residents lowered their eyes. Others nodded quietly. Sheriff Brooks closed the tablet and looked toward the damaged storefront. Then he looked toward the witnesses gathered throughout the station. Finally, he turned back to Linda. His expression had changed. The patience remained, but something firmer now stood behind it. For the first time that afternoon, Linda seemed to realize the conversation was no longer moving in the direction she expected. And standing among the crowd, more than one person began to wonder whether the person facing serious consequences today might not be Marcus Reed after all. The tension that had gripped the station for the past hour slowly gave way to something quieter. Nobody spoke much anymore. The arguments had faded. The accusations had lost their momentum. What remained was uncertainty. Linda stood near the edge of the parking lot, no longer commanding attention the way she had earlier. Her eyes moved repeatedly between Sheriff Brooks, the deputies, and the growing crowd. Every passing minute seemed to chip away at the confidence she had carried into the station. Marcus, meanwhile, walked toward the damaged storefront. The broken glass still covered part of the sidewalk, catching faint reflections from the patrol lights and the fading afternoon sky. Without saying a word, he grabbed a push broom from a storage closet beside the office. Tyler noticed immediately. Mr. Reed, let me do that, he offered. Marcus shook his head gently. Finish helping people. Tyler hesitated. Are you sure? Marcus nodded. People are still waiting. The young employee returned to the pumps while Marcus began sweeping the glass into careful piles. The simple sound of the broom moving across concrete echoed softly through the station. Back and forth. Back and forth. No anger. No frustration. Just steady movement. Several customers watched quietly. An elderly woman sitting in a sedan lowered her window. You should not have to clean that yourself, she said. Marcus offered a small smile. It still needs cleaning. The woman looked away, her eyes suddenly glossy. Nearby, a utility worker removed his baseball cap and held it against his chest. Nobody could explain exactly why the moment felt emotional. Perhaps it was because everyone expected outrage. Perhaps they expected demands, arguments, or public embarrassment. Instead, they were watching a man continue serving his community while cleaning damage to his own business. The late afternoon sunlight slipped beneath the clouds, casting a warm amber glow across the station. The shattered glass sparkled briefly before disappearing into the collection bin. For a few minutes, the world seemed unusually still. Even Sheriff Brooks remained silent. He stood beside his patrol vehicle, observing Marcus from a distance. One deputy approached him quietly. "Most people would be furious." Daniel nodded. "Most people are not Marcus Reed." Across the parking lot, Linda heard the comment. She looked toward Marcus again. For years, she had convinced herself that his reputation was an act, a performance, a strategy. Yet standing there now, she struggled to reconcile that belief with the reality unfolding in front of her. Nobody had cameras pointed at him anymore. No reporters were present. No audience remained to impress. Yet he continued helping people exactly the same way he always had. A little girl stepped out of her mother's minivan and approached the edge of the sidewalk. She could not have been older than 8. She watched Marcus sweep for several seconds before speaking. "Mr. Reed." Marcus paused and looked up. "Yes, sweetheart." The girl pointed toward the fuel pumps. "My mom said we can get home because of you." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Marcus smiled softly. "I am glad you are going home." The little girl smiled back and returned to her mother. Around the station, more than one person lowered their eyes. The breeze carried the scent of fresh rain and gasoline across the lot. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang the top of the hour. And standing beneath the soft evening light, Marcus Reed returned to sweeping the sidewalk as if kindness were simply another ordinary part of the job. The last traces of sunlight stretched across the station as Sheriff Brooks finally stepped forward. The conversation stopped immediately. Even the fuel pumps seemed quieter. Daniel looked around at the crowd before turning toward one of his deputies. "Bring up the footage." The deputy connected the tablet to a portable screen mounted inside a patrol vehicle. Within seconds, video from multiple cameras appeared. The first recording showed the station earlier that afternoon. Customers arrived. Volunteers directed traffic. Families received assistance. Everything appeared orderly. Linda folded her arms. "That proves nothing." Daniel said nothing. The footage continued. Another angle appeared. Then another. A recording from a nearby business. A recording from a resident standing across the street. A recording from a customer waiting near pump 4. Each video showed the same thing. The assistance program operating peacefully. No arguments. No disorder. No emergency. The crowd watched silently. Then the final clip appeared. This one showed the station entrance shortly before deputies arrived. Several people in the crowd immediately recognized the moment. Linda's expression changed. The confidence disappeared from her face almost instantly. On the screen, she could be seen approaching the storefront while employees and customers continued helping families. The video showed her gesturing angrily. It showed witnesses stepping back. It showed the damage to the office window occurring during the confrontation. Nobody spoke as the footage ended. The silence felt enormous. Sheriff Brooks looked toward the gathered residents. "We have reviewed statements from witnesses, surveillance recordings, and county documentation." He paused. The Emergency Fuel Assistance Program was authorized under County Disaster Relief Coordination. A murmur swept through the crowd. Daniel continued. "Mr. Reed has been working directly with County Emergency Management since the storm." More whispers followed. Several people looked at Marcus with newfound surprise. They had known he was helping. They had not known how much responsibility he had accepted behind the scenes. Daniel turned toward Linda. In addition to operating a private business, Mr. Reed was serving as an approved local coordinator for emergency fuel distribution. Linda stared at him. "Nobody told me that." The information was available through public county records, Daniel replied calmly. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Around the station, people began connecting pieces they had never considered before. The long hours, the extra deliveries, the volunteers, the emergency supply trucks that had quietly arrived before dawn each morning. Marcus had never spoken about any of it. He had simply done the work. Linda looked toward him as though seeing him clearly for the first time. Not as the owner of a small gas station, not as the target of years of criticism, but as someone trusted with responsibilities that affected the entire community. Sheriff Brooks exchanged a glance with his deputies. The situation was no longer complicated. The evidence was clear. The facts were established. What everyone had assumed was a local dispute had become something entirely different. The crowd stood motionless as reality settled over the parking lot. For years, many had viewed Marcus Reed as a man running a modest roadside business. Standing beneath the fading evening sky, they were finally discovering that he had quietly become one of the people holding the community together when it needed help the most. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The weight of the truth seemed to settle over the station like the calm that follows a storm. Linda Parker stood near the patrol vehicles, her shoulders no longer squared with certainty. The crowd that had once watched her with agreement now watched her with something else entirely. Some looked disappointed. Others looked saddened. A few simply looked away. Sheriff Brooks spoke quietly with his deputies while the evening light faded across the parking lot. The flashing patrol lights appeared softer now, reflecting against fuel pumps and windshields in long streaks of red and blue. Marcus set the broom aside and walked toward the office entrance. The damaged window still needed replacing. The paperwork would still need filing. Tomorrow would bring another long day. Yet none of that seemed to concern him at the moment. His attention remained on the people waiting for help. Linda finally stepped forward. Her voice was lower than anyone had heard all afternoon. "Marcus!" He stopped and turned. The crowd became silent again. Even Sheriff Brooks paused his conversation. Linda swallowed hard before speaking. "I was wrong." The words seemed difficult for her to say. Years of assumptions and resentment hung behind them. "I thought you were doing this for attention." Marcus said nothing. She looked toward the families standing near the pumps. "I thought I understood what was happening." Her eyes drifted toward the county documents displayed on the tablet screen. "I did not." The silence stretched between them. A cool breeze moved across the lot, carrying the scent of fresh rain from somewhere beyond town. For the first time, Linda seemed smaller than the image she had spent years projecting. Not weaker, simply human. Sheriff Brooks approached slowly. "Mr. Reed," he said, "the county will support whatever course of action you decide to pursue regarding the property damage." Several people exchanged glances. Everyone understood what that meant. The decision rested with Marcus. Linda lowered her eyes. She appeared to be bracing herself for consequences. Marcus looked at the damaged storefront. Then he looked at the families still waiting in line. Finally, he looked back at Linda. "The window can be replaced," he said. The crowd remained silent. "What matters more is what happens after today." Linda looked up. Marcus continued. "This town has been through enough already." The sheriff studied him carefully. "Are you certain?" Marcus nodded. "I would rather spend tomorrow helping people than fighting." The words seemed to catch everyone off guard. One deputy slowly shook his head in disbelief. Another smiled faintly. Linda's eyes filled with emotion she could no longer hide. She opened her mouth as if searching for something to say, but no words came. Across the parking lot, a nurse who had received fuel assistance earlier quietly began clapping. Another resident joined her. Then another. The sound spread gradually through the crowd until dozens of people were applauding. Not for a victory, not for a defeat, for grace. Marcus looked uncomfortable with the attention, as he always did. He simply nodded once and turned back toward the station. The work was not finished. People still needed help. And while others focused on who had been right and who had been wrong, Marcus Reed remained focused on something far more important. The next morning arrived with clear skies and cool air drifting through Oak Hollow. Sunlight spilled across the freshly cleaned parking lot of Reed Fuel Station, turning the dew on the pavement into tiny flashes of gold. The damaged window had already been measured for replacement. A temporary panel covered the opening, plain and unremarkable, as if the events of the previous day were already becoming part of the town's memory. Marcus unlocked the station before sunrise, just as he had done thousands of times before. The familiar click of the front door, the scent of fresh coffee brewing behind the counter, the low hum of refrigeration units waking for the day, all of it felt comfortingly ordinary. One by one, customers began arriving. Utility crews stopped in before heading to repair sites. Nurses on early shifts filled their tanks. Parents drove children to school. Life was moving forward. Near the register sat a small stack of handwritten thank you cards that had appeared overnight. Marcus had not asked where they came from. He simply placed them beside the coffee machine and continued working. Around mid-morning, a familiar vehicle pulled into the lot. Several customers noticed immediately. Linda Parker stepped out slowly. For a moment, she remained beside her vehicle, looking at the station. The building looked exactly the same as it always had. Yet something felt different. Perhaps the change was not in the station at all. She walked toward the entrance carrying a small envelope. When she reached the counter, Marcus looked up from a delivery invoice. Neither spoke immediately. The station remained quiet except for the soft beeping of a fuel terminal outside. Linda placed the envelope on the counter. "For the repairs," she said softly. Marcus glanced at it, but did not open it. Linda looked around the station. At the customers. At the volunteers helping organize supplies near the back lot. At the bulletin board covered with community notices. "I spent years seeing what I wanted to see," she admitted. Marcus listened without interrupting. "I should have paid attention to what you were actually doing." For a moment, the only sound came from a coffee grinder behind the counter. Then Marcus nodded once. "We all get things wrong sometimes." Linda gave a small, uncertain smile. It was not a perfect ending. It was something more realistic. A beginning. Outside, the fuel assistance line had grown shorter as power returned throughout the county. Families were recovering. Roads were reopening. The crisis was slowly fading. Yet the impact of those difficult days remained visible everywhere. Neighbors were helping neighbors. Volunteers were organizing food deliveries. People who had barely spoken before now greeted one another by name. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Marcus stepped outside and looked across the station. Cars came and went. Children laughed from a nearby sidewalk. An American flag moved gently above the roofline. Nothing about the scene appeared extraordinary. That was the beauty of it. Real strength rarely announced itself. Real kindness rarely demanded recognition. It simply showed up, day after day, when people needed it most. Marcus rested one hand against the fuel pump and watched a family pull safely back onto the road. The breeze carried the scent of summer grass across the highway. Somewhere beyond town, church bells rang softly in the distance. And beneath the warm North Carolina sunlight, Reed Fuel Station continued serving the community exactly as it always had, while the quiet dignity of one man's character lingered long after the conflict had faded away.